Cincinnati, autumn 2012. The rain had been falling for 2 days straight, the kind of gray drizzle that made the streets shine like glass and turned every leaf into a soggy piece of paper glued to the pavement. Frank sat at his kitchen table, his coffee already lukewarm, staring at the radio without really listening. Retirement hadn't been the golden stretch of time he had once imagined. It was quiet, yes, but the kind of quiet that sometimes pressed against his chest and left him gasping for air. His wife had been gone for 7 years, and though his children called every now and then, they were too busy with their own lives to stop by more than once or twice a season. At 68, Frank had learned to get used to silence. He had his routines: feeding the neighbor's cat when they were away, fixing things in his garage, walking to the small grocery store down the block. The world seemed steady, predictable, almost boring. That was why the knock at the door on that damp afternoon felt like a crack in reality. It wasn't a polite tap, nor was it the frantic pounding of trouble. It was firm, deliberate, 3 knocks spaced evenly apart. Frank rose slowly, grumbling to himself, wondering who would bother him in weather like this. Jehovah's Witnesses, maybe, or someone selling new windows. He pulled open the door and there she was, a woman in her late 60s, her coat soaked from the rain, her eyes steady in a way that was unsettling. She held a brown leather folder against her chest like it was both shield and weapon. "Frank," she said, not as a question but as a fact, as if she had rehearsed his name 1,000 times before daring to knock. "My name is Eleanor. I'm your sister." Frank almost laughed, though his throat was too dry to make the sound. He didn't have a sister. He had been an only child, his mother had told him that countless times, and she wasn't the kind of woman who forgot or lied about something like that. But the woman's expression wasn't the face of a scammer or a beggar. It was calm, almost sad, like she had expected disbelief. Before he could tell her she was mistaken, she slid a piece of paper from the folder and held it up. His eyes locked on the faded document. A birth certificate, yellowed with time, creased from folding. His mother's name was on it. His father's too. And under child's name, there it was, Eleanor May Caldwell. Born 3 years before him. Frank's hand twitched toward the paper, but he didn't take it. His heart thudded in his chest, and for a moment he thought maybe the coffee had finally caught up with his old ticker. He backed up a step, shaking his head, words fumbling in his mouth. "No," he muttered, barely audible even to himself. She didn't push inside, didn't raise her voice, didn't plead. She just looked at him with those eyes that were far too much like his mother's, eyes that had stared at him from faded photographs his whole life. She tucked the paper back into the folder and said, "I can prove it. But you'll need to decide if you want to know." Then she handed him the folder, turned, and walked down the wet porch steps into the rain without another word. Frank stood there, the folder heavy in his hands, the drizzle soaking the threshold where she had just stood. He didn't call after her. He couldn't. His legs felt rooted to the floor, his lungs straining for air. After a long moment he closed the door, locked it out of habit, and set the folder on the kitchen table. He sat back down, his coffee now cold, and stared at the brown leather like it might suddenly leap open on its own. The kitchen clock ticked, each second louder than the last. Memories churned in his head. His mother humming while ironing shirts, her sharp words when he asked why he had no brothers or sisters, the way she avoided certain questions about family. At the time he had thought nothing of it. Children don't dig for skeletons when they have bicycles and school dances and first jobs to occupy them. But now, staring at that folder, all those little silences from his childhood seemed to gain weight. He reached out, touched the cool leather, then pulled his hand back. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady, relentless, washing the neighborhood clean, as if the world knew that something old and buried was about to come to the surface. Frank sat there until the light outside dimmed into evening, the folder untouched but impossible to ignore. The folder sat on the table all night, untouched, a silent guest in the house. Frank didn't sleep well. He had tried turning on the television, hoping the chatter of late-night talk shows might drown out the restless storm in his head, but the folder kept pulling his attention back. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face, Eleanor, she had called herself, standing in the rain with that calm, steady look, as though she already knew what he would find inside. When dawn came, the sky still heavy with clouds, Frank gave up on pretending to rest. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, stronger this time, and sat down at the kitchen table. The folder was right where he had left it, the brown leather worn and faintly cracked at the corners. He told himself it was foolish to be afraid of paper. He had faced harder things in life: the years at the factory, the war overseas, the slow illness that had taken his wife. And yet, when he finally slid the metal clasp open and pulled out the contents, His hands shook like a boy sneaking a cigarette for the first time. There were documents, neatly stacked, all aged in the same way. The birth certificate he had already seen. Hospital forms stamped in a faded blue ink. Letters written in his mother's distinctive script. He picked one at random, the paper fragile, the ink slightly smudged. It was addressed not to him but to someone named Margaret. The date was from the early 1940s, long before he was born. His mother's words were unmistakable. She wrote about a child she could not keep, about shame, about family pressure. Frank's throat tightened as he read the lines. She spoke of a daughter, hidden away to protect appearances, a secret that had to be buried so her life could continue without scandal. Frank set the letter down, his vision blurring. His mother had been strict, yes, but he had always believed her to be honest, almost to a fault. The idea that she had lived with such a secret, that she had looked him in the eye countless times and told him he was her only child, rattled him to the core. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to process the words, the dates, the truth seeping into his bones. He moved through the stack slowly, each page pulling him further into a story he hadn't known he was part of. Hospital discharge notes listed his mother under a false name. Adoption agency letters explained that the girl had been placed with another family. There were receipts, even photographs, small black and white snapshots of a baby wrapped in a blanket, eyes closed, unaware of the storm that surrounded her existence. For hours, Frank sat at the table, the papers spread before him like puzzle pieces from another life. The more he read, the more he understood that the woman at his door had not been mistaken. She had proof, undeniable and raw, that she was tied to him by blood. His heart clenched at the thought that all these years she had been out there, living a life parallel to his, while he went on believing he had no siblings. He thought back to his mother's silence whenever questions about the past came up. How she bristled if he asked about relatives. How she claimed they had lost touch, or that it wasn't worth discussing. At the time, Frank had accepted it as the guarded nature of a woman who had lived through hard decades. Now it seemed like deliberate erasure, a choice to carve out part of the family and pretend it had never existed. By late morning, his kitchen looked like a small archive. Papers fanned across the table, coffee stains near the edges where he had forgotten to lift his cup. His head ached, not from the reading but from the weight of realization. He stood, paced the narrow length of the room, sat again. Every time he tried to push the thought away, maybe it was all forged, maybe Eleanor had some ulterior motive, the handwriting, the official stamps, the dates pulled him back. Too much matched, too much rang true. He thought about calling his son but quickly dismissed the idea. What could he even say? That a woman had arrived claiming to be his sister and had the paperwork to back it up? His children would think he had lost his mind. Worse, they might see this as an opportunity to argue about money, property, inheritance, things Frank barely cared about but knew could split a family apart. Instead, he gathered the documents carefully back into the folder, closed it and set it on the counter. He felt heavier, older, as though the knowledge itself had aged him overnight. And yet, beneath the weight there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the faint stirrings of responsibility. If what Eleanor claimed was true, then she had lived her entire life with this knowledge, while he had lived in ignorance. That imbalance gnawed at him. The rain outside had eased into a drizzle, the sky a lighter shade of gray. Frank pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch, the cool air bracing. He glanced up and down the street, half expecting to see the woman waiting, but the sidewalk was empty. Only the sound of dripping gutters and the faint rumble of a passing truck filled the morning. He knew he couldn't leave it at this. He had to speak to her again, not because he was ready to accept her story fully, but because he couldn't stand not knowing. She had left her address on a small slip of paper tucked inside the folder. He remembered noticing it when he first opened it, a simple line written in neat cursive, an address on the other side of town near the river. Frank slipped the paper into his pocket, locked the door behind him, and started the old Buick that had sat too long in the driveway. The engine coughed, then steadied. He pulled out, the tires splashing through shallow puddles. His hands gripped the wheel tightly as he drove, the city passing in blurred streaks of wet asphalt and brick houses. For the first time in years, Frank felt the pull of something larger than his routines, something that might unravel him or remake him entirely. He didn't know what he would say when he arrived. He didn't know if he would be angry or cautious or quietly broken. All he knew was that he had to see her again. The drive across town felt longer than it should have. Frank had lived in Cincinnati all his life, and yet the streets on the other side of the river felt foreign, like a part of the city that had never mattered until now. He parked outside a modest brick duplex, its small front yard littered with damp leaves, the remnants of the storm still hanging in the air. For a moment he sat behind the wheel, staring at the front door, gripping the steering wheel as if letting go would send him tumbling into something irreversible. Finally he forced himself out of the car. He knocked once, softer than he had intended. The door opened almost immediately, as though she had been waiting. Eleanor stood there, dry this time, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. No folder in her hands now, no dramatic proof waved in his face. Just her eyes still carrying that strange weight of certainty. She stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. He hesitated, then walked in, the smell of coffee and faint lavender filling his nose. Inside, the home was tidy, carefully arranged, filled with framed photographs that lined the walls and shelves. Most showed children and grandchildren, birthdays, weddings, graduations. He scanned them, his eyes catching on familiar features, small hints of his mother's nose or his father's sharp jawline, repeated in faces of people he had never met. The realization made him dizzy. Eleanor set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from him. There was silence for a while, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Frank kept his eyes on the steam curling from his cup, not ready to meet her gaze. Finally she began to speak, her voice low, steady, almost rehearsed. She told him about her life, about being raised by another family in Kentucky, about never knowing the full truth until she was already grown. She explained how she had spent decades piecing together fragments, letters, whispers, half-truths, and how she had finally found enough to reach him. Frank listened, stiff in his chair, his hands clenched together. The story was overwhelming, filled with details that lined up with the documents he had already seen. Dates matched, names matched. There were even details about their mother, things only someone who had known her could recall, like the way she baked cornbread with too much butter or the hymns she hummed while cleaning. But as convincing as her words were, doubt lingered. His life had been built on the idea that he was alone, an only child. To accept this meant rewriting the foundation of his past. He wanted to demand more proof, wanted to accuse her of playing some elaborate trick, but the bitterness in her voice when she spoke of being hidden, erased, abandoned, it didn't sound like invention. It sounded like pain. When she finally stopped, the silence grew thick again. Frank rose and wandered toward the photographs on the mantel. He stared at one in particular, Eleanor as a young woman, standing in front of a clapboard house with 2 small children clinging to her skirt. The resemblance was undeniable. It was not in the obvious ways but in something subtle, something that hit him deep in the gut, the same way a scent or a song can pull a memory from decades ago. He turned back to her, his lips pressed in a thin line. He didn't speak and she didn't push him. Instead, she slid another envelope across the table, softer this time, almost hesitant. He took it, his fingers brushing the rough paper. Inside were more letters, written by their mother much later, after Frank had already been born. In them, she admitted her regret, her longing for the child she had given away, her inability to face the truth without tearing apart the family she had built. Frank's chest tightened as he read the familiar handwriting confessing what she had never spoken aloud. It was too much. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking the chair over, and muttered something about needing air. Eleanor didn't follow him. She stayed seated, watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher, part sadness, part patience, as though she had known this moment would come. Outside, Frank leaned against the cool brick wall, breathing heavily. His world felt split down the middle. One half the life he had lived, the other half the life he had been denied. The drizzle had stopped, the air sharp with the scent of wet leaves. He thought about calling his daughter, about unloading the storm inside him, but he couldn't. Not yet. He knew what her reaction would be: skepticism, annoyance, warnings about scams and money. She would tell him to cut Eleanor off, to burn the papers, to forget. But forgetting was no longer possible. He drove home in silence, the streets blurred by thoughts he couldn't shake. Back in his kitchen, the folder still lay on the table where he had left it. He dropped the new envelope beside it, sat heavily in the chair, and stared at both like they were weights anchoring him to a past he hadn't chosen. He felt torn between anger at his mother for the deception, grief for the sister he never knew, and suspicion that even now, he might be walking into some deeper trap. As night fell, he sat in the dark, the only light the faint glow from the street lamp outside. His phone buzzed with a message from his son, asking if he was okay. He didn't answer. Instead, he thought of Eleanor's eyes, her voice, the letters written by the same hand that had once packed his school lunches and scolded him for muddy shoes. The pieces fit too well. Still, a single question refused to let him rest. Why had she come now? After all these years, why knock on his door in the rain with proof that could destroy everything he thought he knew? The answer, he feared, was not going to be simple. The following days were restless ones. Frank tried to return to his routines, fixing the loose hinge on the garage door, raking the damp leaves that clung stubbornly to the grass, but nothing felt the same. The folder on the kitchen table became the center of the house, like a quiet, pulsing presence he couldn't escape. He caught himself staring at it whenever he passed, as if waiting for it to open on its own. The letters haunted him most. He reread them late at night, his glasses sliding down his nose, the words blurring as his eyes stung. His mother's careful script cut deeper with every line, confessing truths he could barely accept. He wanted to believe that the story was finished now. Eleanor had come, she had delivered her proof, and he had seen enough to know she wasn't lying. Yet something didn't sit right. It wasn't only the decades of secrecy, or the betrayal of realizing his mother had hidden an entire child. It was Eleanor herself. She had appeared out of nowhere, carrying not just documents but a lifetime of answers neatly assembled, as though waiting for him to unlock them. The thought circled in his head. Why now after all these years? The unease grew stronger when his son visited one evening. David was in his 40s, a man who carried himself with the same stubborn pride Frank recognized in the mirror. Over dinner, David asked about the Buick, whether it was still running, and mentioned a potential buyer if Frank was ever ready to sell the house. There was nothing unusual in his tone, yet Frank felt his stomach tighten. When David noticed the folder on the counter and casually asked what it was, Frank found himself snapping the lid shut and muttering it was nothing important. His son's eyes lingered too long, suspicious, before he changed the subject. That moment stayed with Frank. It was the first time he realized that sharing Eleanor's existence might not only divide his memories, but also fracture what little harmony remained with his children. One afternoon, restless, he drove back to Eleanor's neighborhood. He didn't knock this time, just parked across the street and watched the house. He saw a boy, maybe 12 years old, ride a bicycle up the driveway, dump his backpack on the porch and dash inside. A moment later, Eleanor appeared at the doorway, her arms folding the child into a hug. It was ordinary, almost painfully so, and yet it stirred something in him. That boy was family too, whether Frank wanted to admit it or not. Still, his doubts lingered. What if she wanted something more? Money, perhaps, or a claim to the house. The timing of David's sudden interest in property gnawed at him. He had seen families destroyed over inheritance before, neighbors turned against each other because of wills and deeds. He refused to let that happen, yet the danger felt closer every day. It was late one evening, while sorting through the older letters again, that he found something he had overlooked. A sealed envelope at the bottom of the stack, addressed to him in his mother's hand. His breath caught as he slid it open with shaking fingers. The letter was dated the year before she died. She wrote of her guilt, her fear, and her inability to tell him face to face. By the time you read this, if you ever do, you may know about your sister. I wanted to protect you, but in doing so I lied to us both. She is part of you and part of me. Do not let her carry the weight alone. The words cut through the fog of doubt. It was not just a possibility, it was his mother's own admission. Eleanor wasn't a stranger seeking gain. She was blood. And yet, even with the truth staring back at him, the sense of danger did not ease. The very next morning he received a call from his daughter, Melissa. Her voice was sharp, urgent. She asked whether he had been meeting with a woman, whether he had been talking about family matters that didn't concern anyone else. He froze, the phone slick in his hand. How could she know? The only conclusion was that David had told her. The children were already circling, their voices filled with suspicion, as though they sensed the possibility of losing something they believed was theirs. For the first time in years, Frank felt cornered in his own home. His children, whom he had raised with patience and sacrifice, were beginning to sound less like loved ones and more like adversaries. He couldn't shake the image of their eyes when they would eventually learn the truth, that their grandmother had lied, that their father was not an only child, that they had an aunt who had been erased from their story. He imagined their fury, their accusations, their sudden obsession with property and inheritance. The thought left him restless and afraid, but also resolute. His mother's words echoed in his mind, "Do not let her carry the weight alone." For decades Eleanor had lived with this shadow. Now it was his turn. That night, sleep eluded him once again. He sat in the living room, the letter from his mother in his lap, the clock ticking past midnight. The house was quiet, but his thoughts roared. He realized there was no turning back. The truth was here, undeniable, sitting in his hands. But truth was not a safe thing. It was a weapon, and once wielded, it would change everything. As dawn broke pale and thin, Frank looked at the folder, then at the phone. He would have to choose whether to protect his children from the truth, or to confront them with it, no matter how it shattered their illusions. And in that choice he knew, lay the real storm still waiting to break. Frank knew there was no delaying the inevitable. The weight of the folder, the letters, and his mother's final words had shifted something in him. He could no longer carry this alone, nor could he hide from the storm gathering within his family. The truth had been buried for nearly 70 years, and now it demanded air, no matter how suffocating it felt to release it. The confrontation began on a Sunday afternoon when both David and Melissa arrived unannounced. They stood in his kitchen, their voices sharp, their faces tight with suspicion. They pressed him with questions, their tones echoing each other. Who was the woman he had been seen with? What did she want? Why was he hiding things? Frank sat at the table, silent at first, staring at the folder that lay between them. He could feel the decades of his mother's silence pressing on him, urging him to follow her example and keep the secret. But the letter in his lap burned hotter than fear. He couldn't protect them with lies. With a slow, deliberate movement, he slid the folder forward. His children frowned, their impatience clear, but when he opened the flap and pulled out the documents, the room changed. He spread the papers across the table, the birth certificate, the letters, the photographs. The air grew heavy as Melissa leaned in, her eyes narrowing, while David's face tightened with disbelief. Frank didn't speak much. He let the pages speak for themselves. He watched as his children read their grandmother's confessions, saw the handwriting they knew, the details they couldn't deny. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Melissa covered her mouth, her shoulders stiff, tears threatening but held back. David paced the room, his fists clenched, muttering that this couldn't be real, that it had to be some trick. Yet every attempt to dismiss it faltered under the undeniable evidence. The weight of their grandmother's words could not be erased. When Eleanor stepped quietly into the doorway, Frank had asked her to come, needing her presence to face this moment. The room froze. His children turned toward her, their faces pale, their eyes darting between her and the papers on the table. She looked older than before, more fragile under their scrutiny, but she stood firm. For the first time, the entire truth was gathered in one room, every hidden thread pulled into the open. What followed was not reconciliation, but chaos. David accused her of coming for money, of trying to steal what didn't belong to her. Melissa cried out that their grandmother had lied to everyone, that none of it made sense, that it wasn't fair. Frank sat through it all, the storm of voices swirling around him, until finally he raised his hand and the room fell quiet. His voice was rough but steady as he spoke, telling them that Eleanor was his sister, that their grandmother had wronged her, and that he would no longer deny her place in their lives. The declaration cut like a knife. David's face hardened and he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Melissa stayed longer, torn between disbelief and grief, her eyes darting between her father and the woman she had never known existed. In the end, she left too, saying nothing, her silence more painful than any words could have been. When the house grew quiet again, Frank turned to Eleanor. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he reached across the table, his weathered hand covering hers. No words were needed. The bond was fragile, scarred by decades of absence, but it was real and it was theirs. The weeks that followed were not easy. David avoided him, angry and distant, while Melissa called occasionally but never mentioned Eleanor. The fracture in his family remained, sharp and painful, yet Frank felt something unexpected growing within him. For the first time in years he no longer felt alone. He and Eleanor met often, sharing memories, piecing together a childhood that had been stolen from them both. She told him about her children and grandchildren, and he realized he had an entire branch of family he had never known. One afternoon, as they sat together on his porch watching the autumn light fade, Eleanor handed him a photograph. It was their mother, young and smiling, holding a baby in her arms. Frank stared at it for a long time, the lines of her face so familiar, the expression filled with a tenderness he had almost forgotten. The photograph was proof not just of loss but of love, a love his mother had carried even if hidden. In that moment, Frank felt the bitterness ease. The years of silence, the deception, the anger, they were real, but so was the bond that had survived despite them. He looked at Eleanor and saw not a stranger, not a threat, but the sister he had been denied. The storm had not destroyed him. It had uncovered something stronger. As winter approached, Frank knew his children might never fully accept this truth. They might cling to anger or suspicion, might never forgive the disruption of their comfortable narrative. But he also knew he couldn't shape their hearts. All he could do was live honestly with the truth that had finally come to light. One evening, as the first snow dusted the street, Frank sat alone in the living room, the photograph of his mother and Eleanor resting on the mantel. He thought of the knock on the door that had started it all, of the rain dripping from Eleanor's coat, of the folder that had changed everything. He realized that life had given him something rare in old age, a chance not just to remember the past but to rewrite its ending. And for the first time in many years, Frank felt something close to peace. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.